He was met with scornful glances the moment he walked through the door, and the waiter, with a smug grin, declared, "People like you don't belong here." The red Maga hat on his head became the target of humiliation in front of everyone, but none of them knew who he really was. Within minutes, the self-proclaimed enforcer of justice lost everything. What happened that night when the truth came to light? A man in his mid-40s walked into a bustling restaurant, adorned with a glowing sign that proudly declared, "The best place for family dinners." His appearance was unremarkable: fitted jeans, a neatly pressed button-up shirt, but the bold red Maga hat on his head instantly drew attention. Conversations at nearby tables faltered as diners exchanged disapproving glances. A few people let out audible sighs or scoffs, while others whispered behind raised menus. Behind the host stand stood a young waiter, barely in his 20s, with a smirk plastered across his face. He straightened his posture as if sensing an opportunity to flex his moral superiority. This was his chance to take a stand, or at least, that's what he thought. "Good afternoon," the man said calmly, his voice steady and polite. "I have a reservation under the name Michael." The waiter's smirk vanished, replaced by a furrowed brow. His gaze lingered on the man's hat, the bold white letters standing out like a beacon. "A reservation?" the waiter asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Are you sure you're in the right place, sir? This doesn't seem like your kind of establishment." The man tilted his head, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "I'm sorry, what exactly do you mean by that?" he asked, still maintaining his composure. "You don't get it?" The waiter's smirk returned, now tinged with derision. He pointedly nodded toward the hat. "We don't serve people with those kinds of views here." Nearby staff began to take notice, their quiet murmurs growing louder as they huddled closer, eager to witness the unfolding drama. A couple of diners craned their necks to get a better look, and a few reached for their phones, ready to capture whatever happened next. The man stood still, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the brewing hostility around him. The tension in the room was palpable, as if the restaurant itself had paused to watch the exchange. The man's eyes widened slightly, as if trying to process what he'd just heard. After a brief pause, he asked calmly, "Are you saying you're refusing to serve me?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," the waiter replied with a smug expression. He crossed his arms, standing his ground. "We respect freedom of opinion here, but we don't tolerate symbols of hate." "Symbols of hate?" the man repeated, his brows furrowing slightly. Despite the insult, his voice remained steady. "I'm just here to have dinner, that's all." "Well, not here you're not," the waiter snapped, clearly enjoying the growing tension in the room. "It's better if you leave now, or I'll call security." The man stared at the waiter for a moment, his calm demeanor unwavering, then slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He began typing something, his fingers moving deliberately across the screen. This action seemed to provoke the waiter further. "Oh, you're going to complain now?" he scoffed, his tone dripping with mockery. "Go ahead, I'm not afraid of a bad Yelp review." The man finished typing and looked up. His tone was measured but firm. "If you think I'm leaving, call security. Let's see where this goes." The waiter hesitated for a moment, then turned and waved over a security guard. Within seconds, a tall, broad man in a dark uniform appeared. His eyes briefly scanned the scene before locking onto the man in the Maga hat. "Is there a problem here?" the guard asked, his voice low and authoritative. "Yes," the waiter said quickly, gesturing toward the man. "This guy is refusing to leave after being asked. He's causing a disturbance." The guard nodded and turned to the man. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." The man looked at the guard, his tone still calm, but now laced with quiet authority. "I have a reservation, and I haven't caused any disturbance. I simply asked to be seated." The guard shifted uncomfortably, but repeated, "I'm going to need you to leave." The tension in the room was palpable as diners whispered and exchanged glances. Several pulled out their phones to record, eager to capture what felt like an inevitable escalation. The man in the Maga hat didn't flinch, holding his ground. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The air in the restaurant was thick with tension, the quiet hum of whispers and the soft glow of phone screens capturing every moment of the standoff. The man in the Maga hat stood his ground, his posture calm but resolute, while the waiter fidgeted with growing impatience. The security guard shifted awkwardly, clearly unsure whether to escalate the situation further. Then, like a crack of thunder breaking a storm, the restaurant's double doors swung open. In walked a woman dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, her heels clicking against the tiled floor with authority. She exuded professionalism, her presence commanding attention as she scanned the room. Her neatly styled hair and clipboard tucked under her arm left no doubt. This was someone in charge. Her sharp eyes swept across the scene, freezing when they landed on the man in the Maga hat. For a moment, she stopped in her tracks, her expression shifting from confusion to sudden realization. "Mr. James!" she exclaimed, striding toward the man with urgency. Her voice carried across the room, breaking the hushed murmurs of the crowd. "I am so sorry for this misunderstanding." The waiter's smirk instantly vanished, replaced by a look of pure bewilderment. He blinked a few times, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. The security guard straightened, looking between the woman and the man, suddenly unsure of his next move. The waiter finally found his voice, though it wavered with uncertainty. "Excuse me, who is this?" he asked, his bravado now replaced with nervousness. The woman turned to him, her expression hardening as she addressed him. "This is Mr. James," she said firmly, her voice carrying an edge that silenced the room. "He's the owner of this restaurant. In fact, he owns the entire chain." The waiter's face drained of color as the weight of her words sank in. He took a step back, stammering. I didn't know. I mean, there must be some kind of mistake." "There's no mistake," the woman interrupted, her tone cold and final. She turned back to Mr. James, her expression softening into one of apology. "I deeply regret what's happened here, sir. This behavior is absolutely unacceptable." Mr. James sighed softly, rubbing his temple as if to release the frustration he'd been holding in. He met her gaze and replied, his voice steady. "It seems like there's a serious issue with how guests are treated here." The waiter, now visibly trembling, tried to interject. "It was just a misunderstanding. You thought wrong," the woman snapped, cutting him off. "And your behavior reflects poorly on this establishment." The security guard, sensing the shift in authority, gave a quick nod and quietly stepped back toward the entrance, leaving the scene entirely. Meanwhile, the murmurs among the diners grew louder, the realization of what was happening spreading through the room like wildfire. A few people even began to clap, though the waiter's face flushed with humiliation. The manager gestured toward an empty table near the center of the room, a prime spot with impeccable lighting and a view of the entire dining area. "Mr. James, please allow me to personally escort you to your reserved table." Mr. James gave her a small, polite nod and began walking toward the table. As he passed the now silent waiter, he paused briefly, turning to meet the young man's wide, panic-stricken eyes. "You know," he said quietly, though his words carried enough weight to make everyone lean in. "This restaurant is supposed to be a place where everyone feels welcome." Without waiting for a response, he continued to his table. The manager followed closely, whispering instructions to another staff member to ensure everything was perfect. The diners, now fully invested in the drama, exchanged excited whispers, a few even standing to applaud Mr. James as he sat down. The waiter stood frozen in place, his career crumbling before his eyes. As Mr. James settled into his seat at the center of the restaurant, the buzz of murmurs from the other diners began to fade, replaced by an expectant silence. The manager, still visibly flustered, stood by his side, clutching her clipboard, as though it might shield her from the palpable tension in the room. She cleared her throat softly and leaned slightly toward him. "Mr. James," she began, her voice low but resolute, "I want to sincerely apologize for what just happened. I will personally handle this situation and ensure it never happens again." Mr. James looked up at her, his expression calm but unyielding. "Good," he said with a measured nod. Start by firing him. Right now. People who think they can demean others based on their beliefs have no place working in my company." The manager straightened, her professionalism returning in full force. She turned sharply to the waiter, who stood a few feet away, pale and visibly shaken. "You're fired," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. The waiter's eyes widened in shock, and his voice cracked as he protested. But this isn't fair. You can't do this." Mr. James rose slowly from his seat, his imposing presence drawing every eye in the room. He fixed the waiter with a steady gaze, his voice calm but cutting as he replied, "Unfair. Unfair is being refused service because of your beliefs. Unfair is being treated like you don't belong somewhere because of the way you think or the way you look. That's what's unfair." He turned slightly, addressing not just the waiter, but the entire room. His voice grew stronger, carrying a quiet authority that demanded attention. "This restaurant," he continued, gesturing to the space around him, "was built to be a place where everyone feels welcome. Not just people who agree with you, not just people who look like you. Everyone." The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. Diners clapped enthusiastically, a few even cheering as Mr. James took his seat again. The waiter, his face flushed with humiliation, glanced around the room, realizing he had no allies left. With a final defeated look, he turned and hurried toward the exit, his footsteps heavy with regret. As the door closed behind him, the applause only grew louder. Someone from across the room called out, "You're a good man, Mr. James!" Another diner lifted their glass in a toast, and the energy in the room shifted from tense to jubilant. Meanwhile, phones buzzed as diners began sharing their videos of the incident. Within minutes, clips of Mr. James's firm yet fair response were flooding social media. Comments poured in praising his stance, calling him a true leader and an example of how to handle discrimination with grace and strength. Back at the table, the manager spoke softly. "I'll make sure this incident is documented and shared with all our staff. Thank you for setting an example, Mr. James." He nodded, his attention now shifting to the menu in front of him. "Make sure it doesn't happen again," he said simply. The night carried on, the restaurant now filled with a renewed energy. Guests chatted animatedly, sharing their admiration for Mr. James and his handling of the situation. Outside, the waiter stood in the cold, realizing the weight of his actions and the consequences they had brought. Inside, Mr. James calmly ordered his dinner, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet, the message he left behind reverberated far beyond the walls of the restaurant, a clear and powerful stand against prejudice.